The United States in World War I. Here you see a map. In red you have the Central Powers, in green the Allied powers, and yellow are the countries that remained neutral. And so you see how the Central Powers are sandwiched between the green. So you have an Eastern Front and you have a Western Front. And in the Western Front, you've got Germany, France, and Belgium. This part of the war, this front, was characterized by trench warfare that was really a stalemate for many, many years. It didn't move more than 10 miles either way. So it's all about endurance. There are bombardments, new technology, new war technologies like poison gas are deadly, and machine guns. As well as no man's land. So the trench provided some cover, but every now and then you were ordered to go over the top, which you must do, and then you were just, a sitting duck out in the middle, just open to everything. So it was extremely deadly, this trench system. It was a pretty complex network, though. It's not in a straight line, but it's also muddy and disgusting, full of trench rats. There was a condition known as trench foot, which you can only imagine from all the mud and wet feet and just disgusting. Trench fever as well. The Eastern Front is between Germany and Russia, which it was not as, it really didn't use trench warfare much at all. It was more flexible in movement because it was a different terrain, right? You have a lot of mountains, you have a lot of trees. The Eastern Front is no longer a factor when Russia has a revolution and needs to leave the war. Again, some of the new weapons used in World War I, machine guns, rapid fire there, U-boats or submarines, tanks were used, poison gas was used, airplanes, zeppelins, barbed wire, grenades, just extremely deadly, especially in the Western Front where you are trapped in these trenches. And so this was a war of technology. Killing was done on a massive scale. Machine gun enabled a man to shoot 500 rounds per minute. So if somebody does step into no man's land, you're pretty much going to die. Land destruction was severe. There was heavy artillery and bombardment. Just a lot of gunpowder here. In the midst of the Eastern and Western Front, the United States remained neutral, right? And here is something from the time, a drawing from the time. I'm neutral, but not afraid of any of them, right? So you have all these different dogs here. The American Bull Terrier is staying out, even though he's very strong. Wilson wanted to avoid the cultural conflicts that might come up if we were to take a side, because we of course have people of German and Austrian descent, of Russian descent, British, French. What side do we join? Economically, we were doing fantastic because we were supplying the war effort, mostly on the Allied side. So even though we did not join a side, we were supplying one side in particular. Propaganda was rampant, posters urging people, to portraying the other side as an enemy and how we need to get involved. Both Germany and Britain sent propaganda to the United States, but really Britain's propaganda, making the Germans look like evil, evil people, was more effective here in the United States. And then the Lusitania was sunk. So Germany had been involved in unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning they would torpedo down a ship that was in British waters without really checking to see, is this a passenger ship, is this a neutral ship? And so the Lusitania was a British passenger ship, and it sunk, and 128 Americans were killed. And this was one of the first straws leading us into war. Again, a luxury passenger liner sunk by the German U-boat. The Germans did warn passengers of unrestricted warfare. They did say, we are out here with our submarines, you need to be careful. But neutral ships are supposed to be protected. They're supposed to be able to move about. So people thought that freedom of the seas was in jeopardy. So Germany did agree to only attack supply ships, but they did not hold on to that promise. Less than a year later, Germany attacked the French passenger ship, the Sussex. Wilson threatened Germany and it issued the Sussex pledge to not sink merchant vessels without warning and without saving human lives. This next cartoon here portrays another event that leads us into war. So you see the German Kaiser, you can tell by the hat there, is talking to a Mexican, join Germany and you get a bit of the United States. So what does this have to do with? It's the Zimmermann telegram. It was sent by Germans and intercepted by the British, and it promised territory to Mexico that it had lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War in exchange for an alliance. And the United States definitely viewed this as a pretty serious act of hostility, trying to get Mexico to join the war on their side, and then when the war was finished, they would help them go to war with us. And then the other event that really led us into war was the Russian Revolution. You can see pictured here. So in March 1917, Russia revolted against Tsar Nicholas II. So Russia had been ruled for many, many years as an absolute rule kind of government with the Tsar at the head, or in other words, a king. And they moved toward starting a Republican democratic government. And we love that, right? We don't really want to be allied with a king, an absolute ruling king, but we don't mind being allied with a democracy. And furthermore, it was unclear if Russia could continue in the war. And so Americans wanted to support and involve itself in this new democracy. Wilson was quoted as saying, "Let's make the world safe for democracy." So by entering the war at this point, we're helping Russia and we're helping other democratic countries. It didn't hurt that later that month the Germans sank 3 American merchant ships, making us even more angry. So here you kind of see Wilson now, American ship sunk without warning, American lives lost, and so he's writing in, and it even looks like he moved up the date, right? He was going to wait a little bit, but he's ready to go to war right away. So April 2nd, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. It's approved, and the United States declared war on Germany and prepared to join the Allies. But we did, in fact, need to prepare. We needed soldiers. So the Selective Service Act was passed, requiring men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for, to be drafted into the armed forces. They were trained with limited supplies. Many of them had to use broomsticks instead of actual guns in training. African Americans were allowed to serve, but only in segregated units. And again, they were still skeptical of having them go into combat. They were still more comfortable having them do the menial tasks of the army and not go into combat. But they were allowed, some of them. This time, though, Hispanic soldiers were often assigned to menial tasks, but Hispanic soldiers, as well as recent immigrants, lots of soldiers we found were illiterate, and so they learned to read by joining the armed forces. The AEF was a group of soldiers that went overseas under the command of General John Pershing. They arrived by convoy, so we're worried about submarines, so we have a troops transported by ships surrounded by destroyers or cruisers for more safety. Pershing had the American troops serve in American units and not as individuals joining European forces. So he insisted that they don't join on with the British or the French, but that they stay in their own American units. Meanwhile, in Russia, this man takes power. Right? November 1917, the Bolsheviks, so not democratic Republican people, but communists, are led in another revolution, right? So the revolution had been turning toward democracy, but in November it turns with Vladimir Lenin taking control to a communist government. Lenin withdrew Russia from the war and signed a treaty with Germany. So now Germany was able to focus all of its energy on the Western Front, and no longer did it have to be split between the Western and Eastern Front. So the Americans here, you can see, they're going to bring in a burst of energy, which is going to be very important. The troops that are already there are tired. They've been fighting for a long time. By May 1917, the Germans had advanced 70 miles northeast of Paris, so they're closing in on Paris. But June 1918, the Americans helped the French stop the Germans at Chateau Thierry. In northern France, the Marines recaptured the forest of Belleau Wood and 2 other villages, stopping the German advance. And again, they really just needed fresh, invigorated troops. So the armistice, the peace, the stopping of shooting is signed. Berlin is seized, as you see. The Kaiser flees. So July 15th, 1918, the war has ended. The Germans started their last offensive at the Second Battle of the Marne. What happened is they were coming up to the bridges at the Marne. The U.S. 3rd Division blew up every bridge the Germans had built across the Marne. The AEF began their counterattack, and then they were able to keep advancing until November 11th, 1918. The armistice was signed. And in the end of all of that, 8.5 million people had been killed. So a huge amount of death and destruction. So that brings us to the end of the war. The United States gets involved for a variety of reasons that you should know, and they really help to turn the tide for the Allied powers. And it will be interesting to see as we move forward how the war comes to an end, who gets blamed, how things get repaired.